From the magnificent Takht-e-Nishan throne illuminated by Belgian chandeliers, His Exalted Highness Mir Usman Ali Khan had watched in impotent rage as the malign red flags of revolution flowered across his reign. In the summer of 1948, two brigades of the Indian Army swept aside what remained of his rotting kingdom. Then, India's hammer was raised again, this time to crush the communist insurgents who had crippled the Nizam's regime and now defied the new Indian state across swathes of Telangana. Thousands died in the savage campaign that followed. Historians Jonathan Kennedy and Sunil Purushottam have recorded in a seminal study. Fake encounters and disappearances became commonplace. Entire Adivasi villages were relocated at gunpoint into camps which, an official 1951 Military Intelligence Directorate note reported, lacked, I quote, the bare necessities of life. Last week, the Union government decided to withdraw the Armed Forces Special Powers Act from parts of Assam, Manipur and Nagaland. This historic move is likely to fuel calls for the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or AFSPA, to be lifted from other theatres of conflict, including Kashmir. New Delhi should listen very carefully to those calls. From India's own painful learnings as well as global experience, the AFSPA decision makes it necessary to ask three fundamental questions. Have India's decade-old counter-insurgency practices really helped end political violence? Are armies the right tool to deal with violent ideological conflicts? And finally, what alternatives might there be? For generations, Indian discussions on counter-insurgency have been curiously amnesiac. Mizoram, for example, has been held out as a success story where years of counter-insurgency attrition by the army finally enabled a durable political agreement. The savagery that preceded that settlement has figured only, so to speak, in the footnotes. The civil servant Vijendra Jaffa, for example, recorded how villagers were forced to burn down their own homes and crops as part of a campaign to sever ties between communities and insurgents. The brutal military measures, though, only yielded a grim stalemate. In 1986, Jaffa recorded, the government signed a peace deal which basically involved, I quote, getting the insurgents into the Congress I fold and pouring in enormous quantities of money for the enrichment of this class. Like elsewhere in the Northeast, the price of peace were corrupt, dysfunctional polities. Telangana is an even more emphatic example of the limits of what force can achieve. The crushing of the Maoist insurgency of 1946-1951 did not prevent the rise of a second phase in the 1960s and a third in the 1970s, this time focused on West Bengal and Bihar. The latest phase, which began in the 1990s, is diminished, sure, but it still claims very significant numbers of lives. Evidence exists that the massive use of force was counterproductive. In November 2009, Home Minister P. Chidambaram, drawing on then fashionable clear, hold and build counter-insurgency doctrine, pumped in central police personnel into Bastar. G.K. Pillai, the then Home Secretary, announced, within 30 days of security forces moving in and dominating the area, we should be able to restore civil administration. Fatalities in 2009 rose to 359, significantly higher than the previous year, which had recorded 169. The outcome of the massive commitment of force meant to end violence was actually even more violence. Kashmir, where violence against civilians was commonplace in the 1990s, has seen low levels of violence since 2003. There's reason to question, though, if that is primarily because of the use of military force or strategic decisions by Pakistan's intelligence services to reduce their trans-border support for jihadists. Levels of violence rose from 1990 to 1996 and again from 1999 to 2003 in line with Pakistani decisions. Indian force levels did not impact or retard these escalations. Even more important, the reduction in violence levels hasn't led to social and political stability, which is of course the end state sought through counter-insurgency. 3 times since violence reduced after 2003, that is in 2008, 2010 and 2016, the Indian state was challenged by large-scale Islamist-led popular uprisings. For several decades after independence, the state's security apparatus was anemic. Few states had functional police forces, the intelligence services were stretched, the army was the only means available with government to restore order, if not law, when crises like Kashmir erupted. Even though the state's coercive tools have grown in the decades since though, its thinking on counter-insurgency hasn't. Why is this? Indian police and military academies have long based their teachings on British colonial counter-insurgency experience. Force must be massively employed at the outset, these doctrines state, in order to make it possible for insurgents to be isolated from the population. Following this, military commanders must seek to win the population's support by instituting development and ensuring justice. There are many cases taught at academies which bear out this doctrine, but with one common problem. All these stories are untrue. The historian Caroline Elkins has shown that British counterinsurgency in Kenya in fact consisted of interning a very significant proportion of the population in concentration camps and institutionalizing mass torture and rape. Paul Dixon's work on the legendary Gerald Templar, the author of the so-called Hearts and Minds doctrine, makes clear that what he was really doing was savage coercion across Malaya. Here's what Hearts and Minds really look like. These words from a British Special Forces officer recalling his interrogation of a Mau Mau insurgent in Kenya. I cut his balls off. He had no ears, and his eyeball, the right one I think, was hanging out of his socket. Too bad he died before we got too much out of him. The savagery marginally delayed the British Empire's inevitable retreat from Africa and did not help keep Malaya within the empire, which was the point. British counterinsurgency was therefore a strategic failure. In Algeria, Special Forces officer Roger Trinquier recounted, France found itself confronting, I quote, an adversary employing arms and methods the army itself ignores. He concluded in memorable words, our military machine reminds one of a pile driver attempting to crush a fly, indefatigably persisting in repeating its mistakes. Faced with this challenge of how to fight insurgents, Trinquier advocated the use of irregular tactics like the British ones, which included torture. France did record military successes as a result, but the population of Algeria became so hostile that strategic defeat became inevitable. The United States, the author Neil Sheehan has recorded, had much the same experience in Vietnam. So what should we do? The problem this global experience shows isn't AFSPA. AFSPA just gives the Indian Army the same protections that police forces operating in the very same environment also have. AFSPA's most controversial provision gives soldiers immunities from prosecution or human rights violations, but near identical provisions are in place for police nationwide. The real problem is that armies are not designed to fight campaigns against ideologically driven unconventional enemies who are enmeshed in the civil population. As India considers its next steps in Kashmir, the government needs to ask if keeping large numbers of troops is in fact serving any meaningful end. First, the number of troops committed in Kashmir haven't altered in spite of the reduction of violence levels. We don't have any official figures on force levels, there are none published. But the then Northern Army commander, Lieutenant General H.S. Panag, had said in 2007 that about 1/3 of the 330,000 troops deployed in the state were kept there for counterinsurgency. Maintaining such a large force level for counterinsurgency makes little sense given that there are today just some 250 terrorists active, armed according to official figures with nothing more than pistols. Secondly, the Jammu and Kashmir police has shown a robust ability to combat terrorism in the state cities, where the army people don't generally know is not deployed. Third, central and state police forces have demonstrated that they can contain challenges to state authority. The police force, backed by central police reinforcements, succeeded in ensuring peace after Kashmir's special constitutional status was withdrawn. Although risks are involved, among them the prospect that Pakistan might resume large-scale support for jihadists at some point in the future, India's intelligence services are far better equipped to warn of looming crisis than in the 1990s. Troops withdrawn from counter-insurgency, moreover, can be moved to the line of control and rapidly cycle back if a crisis should ever break out. Large-scale military deployments for counter-insurgency in Kashmir serve no clear objectives, fuel alienation among the population, and anger among the region's people. More important, they allow civil administration and civil institutions to evade their responsibilities. Learning from India's troubled counter-insurgency history, it's time to transition to an order that is centered around the criminal justice system and the rule of law. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint.